The wind howls like a hungry wolf across the frozen fjord, rattling the wooden walls of the small homestead crouched beneath a drift of snow. Outside, the world is a wasteland of white and iron-grey sky, a graveyard for the careless and the unprepared. Yet inside, under the low-timbered roof of a Viking longhouse, life persists against all odds. By the dim glow of the central hearth, a woman named Astrid stirs a pot hung above glowing coals. She is older than the snow itself, so the village children say, her hair a tangle of grey braids bound with scraps of woven wool. Smoke curls around her head like a spirit, carrying the sharp scent of dried juniper and salt fish. Near her feet, 2 small boys sleep curled beneath wolf pelts, their soft breaths visible in the chill air. The walls of the longhouse are thick with turf and rough-hewn planks, sealed with moss against the cutting wind. Hooks overhead drip with slabs of smoked meat and bundles of herbs, tied tight with twine, the hoarded wealth of a people who know what hunger truly means. Beyond the hearth's glow, shadows swallow the far corners where barrels stand in neat rows, brimming with salted herring, dried roots, and sour cabbage. Astrid listens as the wind claws at the thatch roof. She knows it well, the endless dark, the storms that bury boats in drifts taller than a man. She remembers the lean winters when wolves came scratching at the door and families starved by the dozens because they failed to bury enough beneath the earth. She hums an old lullaby as she ladles steaming broth into a horn cup. In it floats a root pale, fibrous, smelling faintly of the soil where it slept for months after the harvest. Angelica root, they call it. To Astrid, it is more precious than silver. Without it, and the pits where it lay hidden under layers of straw and frost, the children would not have survived to see the sun rise again. She sips. Warmth blooms in her chest, steady and slow. Behind her, a shuttered window rattles in its frame. For a moment, she imagines she sees movement in the drifted yard, a ghost of frost, a memory of neighbours lost to hunger in her girlhood. She pushes the thought away. They had been fools, she thinks. They trusted too much in the hunt, in the promise of raided silver and slaughtered game. They forgot the oldest truth of these lands, that the earth remembers, even when the trees are bare and the rivers sleep beneath ice. Astrid glances at the boys curled by the hearth, her grandsons, the last of her line. If they are to live through the months ahead, they must learn the secret too. Not the secret of the axe or the sword, but the deeper magic, the hidden roots beneath the snow, the smoke that clings to dried fish, the pits that guard life when the sun forgets the north. Outside, the wind howls again, battering the low door as if testing the strength of its iron hinges. Astrid does not flinch. She has buried food deeper than the wolves can smell. She has lined her root cellar with straw and salt. She has packed smoked fish in barrels tight enough to last until the rivers crack and the first buds push through frozen earth. And so she hums, stirs her pot, and waits. Shadows move in the snow beyond the walls, but inside, warmth glows where roots sleep, fish hang, and the last hope of her bloodline dreams at her feet. The North is a land that does not forgive. It does not bend to the will of the plough or the promise of summer. For those who once called themselves Northmen the Northmen, the Vikings' survival in these latitudes was never guaranteed, only wrestled from the land by force and cunning. In the deep heart of winter, when the sun drifts low and disappears behind the horizon for weeks at a time, the air itself becomes a predator. The sea freezes near the shore, trapping boats in ice like insects in amber. Frost creeps beneath doorways and seeps through chinks in the timber walls. Fire becomes not a luxury, but a shield, thin as a breath, against the infinite dark. The Viking world stretched from the green fjords of western Norway to the frozen rivers of Sweden and the wind-swept plains of Denmark. Though each clan laid claim to its own strip of soil, all were bound by the same unyielding cycle. Brief bursts of warmth and light, followed by long months of blackened sky and snow, so deep it could swallow whole villages. Farmers knew the cruel math well. The soil in much of Scandinavia is thin and rocky, the growing season fickle, sometimes only 3 or 4 months between the last spring frost and the first autumn one. A single bad harvest could tip a household from abundance to famine. Too much rain, an early frost, blight on barley, or rot in the root cellars, any could bring ruin. It was no wonder that the Vikings became raiders and traders. The hunger drove them outward in long ships, prowling the coasts of Ireland, England, and Francia. Silver and plunder fed their fame, but silver could not be eaten. When the sails lowered and the dragon ships returned to their misty harbours, it was the stores buried in the ground, the secret pits of turnips and cabbages, the salted barrels of fish that determined who would see the thaw of spring. Winter demanded more than brute strength or the swing of an axe. It demanded foresight, craft, and a ruthless attention to detail. It demanded that every household become its own fortress against starvation. Not every family succeeded. The old sagas speak more often of heroes who braved storms at sea or fell in glorious battle than of the quiet heroism that took place beneath the soil. Yet it was the hidden cellars, the cold pits dug deep into frost-hardened earth, that truly kept clans alive when the sun fled south. To be Viking was to be a gambler by nature, but not with winter. The old ones knew you could raid kingdoms and plunder monasteries, but if you failed to guard your hearth and cellar, death would wait just beyond the door when the snow came. When we imagine the Northmen today, we picture berserkers howling into battle, sails swelling in cold gales. But their greatest enemy was not the armoured knight on a foreign shore. It was the season that took children from cradles and left warriors hollow-eyed and thin by the hearth. In that world, knowledge of how to keep warmth in the bones and food in the belly became a kind of magic, a secret handed down from mother to daughter, from elder to youth, in whispered advice beside the embers of the fire. And so they built their lives around this secret, how to outlast the wolves outside the door and the hunger that lurked in the dark spaces of winter. Some years the gamble was lost, but in the years when the trick worked, when the pits stayed dry, the roots unspoiled, the smokehouse full the Norsemen endured, and in enduring they became legend. Picture a Viking farmstead on a rare clear day in late autumn. Frost glitters on the earth like a thin veil of iron filings. Smoke curls from the roof hole of a longhouse, drifting into a sky already pale with the promise of early dusk. Outside, a boy named Leif, no more than 12 winters old, helps his father turn the last soil before it freezes solid until spring. Their breath ghosts in the cold air. Leif's father, Eric, pauses to wipe sweat from his brow with the back of a fur-lined glove. He glances at the low sun. There is no time left for mistakes. For Eric and every head of household in the north, this moment is the razor edge upon which survival teeters. Too much has been wagered this year. A portion of the family's stores traded for iron tools and salt. A few sheep sold to pay a distant jarl's tax. His 2 older sons are away on a trading voyage or a raiding voyage, depending on whom they meet first along the coast. If they return, they will bring silver and perhaps dried fish or grain from foreign shores. If they do not return, this narrow strip of frozen field must feed everyone left behind. This was the quiet truth of Viking life. The sagas glorify the storm and sword, the crash of shields, and the roar of a longship's crew. But while young men dreamed of far-off lands and king's gold, it was the earth that decided who ate and who starved. A single household could not stand on one pillar alone. A Viking farmstead balanced precariously on three: the yield of the fields and gardens, the bounty of the sea and forests, and the gamble of what might be brought home from distant shores. Without any one of these, the roof beams creaked and the hearth fire shrank. Summer and early autumn were frantic seasons. Fields of barley and rye must be reaped before sudden rains. Root vegetables, turnips, skirwhite, wild angelica must be lifted from the soil and buried deep again in dry pits, lined with straw and sealed against rodents. Wild herbs were gathered, fish caught and salted, firewood split and stacked higher than a man's head. Each task alone was not enough. Without salt, fish would rot. Without pits dug into the frost-hardened earth, roots would blacken and sweeten too soon, tempting mould and ruin. If a single family lacked enough hands, they might barter with neighbours a cut of smoked trout in exchange for a day of digging pits or patching a leaking thatch. And always, the horizon tempted the restless. Young men like Eric's sons took to the sea, paddling dragon-prowed ships down fjords into the North Sea, bound for trading posts in the Baltic, Frankish river towns, or the gold-laden monasteries that studded distant coasts. They chased silver to buy new blades and fine cloth, but their true prize was grain, salt, iron, and other necessities that their rocky homeland could not provide in abundance. At home, the old and the young tended what was left behind. The hidden stores in pits, the fish in the smokehouse, the livestock huddled in byres. They were the unnoticed keepers of life. A single winter's carelessness, a poorly sealed pit, a smoked ham left to mould could undo the plunder of a whole summer's raids. So it was that every Viking farmstead was a careful dance of risk and prudence. The fragile balance between hunger and plenty lay in the hands of everyone, from the boy turning soil with frostbitten fingers to the seafarer braving storms for a barrel of foreign salt. This was the hidden side of Viking power, not the clangor of steel on shield, but the hush of the cellar, the dry breath of straw, the hoarded roots waiting in the dark to defy the wolves and the frost. Without that balance, no amount of raiding or silver could save them when the sea turned to ice and the land locked its treasures beneath iron ground. If the skalds and saga-tellers sang true, the glory of the Viking age was born from iron and salt waves, the clang of swords, the thunder of longships. But they seldom sang of the quiet hands that made the songs possible. The farmers, the planters of seeds and keepers of pits who turned meagre soil into survival. Long before the prow of a dragon ship broke the dawn mist off Lindisfarne, or the sails of Leif Erikson's crew caught the Greenland wind, it was the tillers of the soil who laid the foundation for every voyage. Without their patient labour, no warrior would have had the strength to lift a shield or row an oar across the cold Black Sea. A Viking settlement was, first and always, a farm. Its bones were wood and turf, its breath the smoke of peat fires and dung fires banked through long nights. Its wealth was measured not in silver arm rings, but in the number of cattle, the weight of smoked fish, the depth of the root cellar dug beneath the frost line. It was often the women, mothers, wives, and daughters who knew the secret life of the pits better than any man. When the warriors sailed west to raid, and the young men followed the traders' rivers east into the Slavic forests, the women stayed behind to guard the true treasure: the seeds, the roots, the dried leaves, and the buried barrels. Astrid, the elder by the hearth, was once such a woman in her youth. When she was 14 winters old, she learned to lay a straw between angelica roots, so frost would not turn them black and bitter. She knew the scent that warned of mould. She knew when to open the pit to check for rot, and when to bury it deeper beneath packed snow. Across Scandinavia, the Norse farmers were more than simple tillers of fields. They were herbalists, foragers, and forest hunters. They watched the rhythms of sun and moon, knew which herbs to dry in smoky rafters, and which must be buried cool and dark. They knew when to slaughter livestock so the meat would keep longest, how to salt herrings so tight in barrels that a single leak could spell ruin. Men who returned from the sea half-starved, wind-burned, and salt-crusted found their true salvation, not in gold stolen from distant monks, but in the cellars dug behind turf walls by those who stayed behind. The eldest daughters brewed ale from barley, watched over milk as it soured into skyr and butter. Grandmothers tended fires where fish flesh slowly hardened to leather in thin curls of smoke. A good farmer's knowledge was as powerful as any chieftain's oath. The best had gardens brimming with hardier vegetables, fat hen, skir-white, wild onions. They lined their pits with birch bark or woven reeds to keep damp at bay. They traded secrets with neighbours, which herbs kept meat from turning, which root cured scurvy when the sea gave only salt and ice. At gatherings, when the longhouse filled with songs of raids and king's boasts, the old women sat quietly at the hearth's edge. They spoke little, but watched much, for they knew what the warriors often forgot. Steel rusts, silver is spent, but a well-dug pit filled with roots and smoked meat could mean the difference between life and death when the fjords froze solid and no sails moved upon the sea. And so the hidden heroes of the north were not the shield-biting berserkers alone, but the quiet farmers and their wives, whose wisdom seeped into the soil and slept beneath the snow, the true keepers of the secret winter trick that kept their kin alive for months when the world outside turned to iron and bone. In the minds of modern storytellers, the Viking table groans under the weight of haunches of venison, whole boars turned on spits, horns of mead spilling golden foam onto furs. Around it, bearded men roar with laughter, tearing flesh from bones with iron knives and iron teeth. Yet step into the longhouse of any real Norse farmstead on a February night, and you would find a different truth, one far humbler, more ingenious, and more quietly miraculous. Yes, they ate meat, but the hunt could fail, the herds could thin, meat spoiled when salted improperly. And so the real bounty that carried the Northmen through the deep freeze was green and root-borne, hidden away like a treasure beneath dirt and straw. The average Viking diet was surprisingly plant-rich, out of necessity more than preference. Coastal folk lived on dried fish and sea kale. Inland farmers coaxed hardy root vegetables from stingy soil, nape, turnips, skir-white spinel, angelica, and a host of wild greens now forgotten by modern tongues. When the fields yielded little, they turned to what could be found at the forest's edge, berries dried and sealed in birch bark boxes, nettles and fat hen, a weed so nutritious the Norse once cultivated it deliberately and ate it by the handful. Preserving these gifts demanded craft as keen as forging an axe. Turnips were buried in deep pits, their necks capped with straw and turf to keep frost from turning them to mush. Cabbages were shredded and packed in brine primitive sauerkraut that staved off scurvy months after the last fresh leaf withered under ice. Fish was not always fresh from the sea. More often, it was dried to a leathery slab and eaten with stews thickened by roots and forest herbs. Even meat, when scarce, was stretched. A single joint of pork boiled with handfuls of turnip greens could feed a household for days when padded with barley or stale bread soaked in the broth. Astrid, the old matron who watched over her grandsons by the fire, had seen too many men starve for want of what they called mere weeds. She knew what the sagas forgot to praise, that the bite of a bitter green at midwinter could mean the difference between a child's grave and another spring's. Planting. In the flickering glow of the hearth, the boys do not dream of meat alone. They dream of the turnip pits beneath the frozen earth, of barrels lined with pickled cabbage and salted fish. They dream of their grandmother's thin, hearty stew, not because it is rich, but because it is enough. Enough to see them through another snowstorm, another howling night when the wind claws at the door. Enough to hold back the hollow ache of hunger that waits like a wolf just beyond the lamplight. The myth of endless meat and mead hides this deeper truth. The real feasts were quiet acts of survival, buried in the ground long before the first flake of snow fell. When the heroes of the sagas returned from far coasts, it was not the silver in their satchels that saved them, but the roots in the cellar and the humble greens that outlasted the cold. This was the secret, a winter trick so simple yet so profound that it fed the strongest warriors, not with glory, but with the earth's plain gift, guarded by farmers, tended by women, hidden beneath frost until the sun returned to claim the north once more. Deep in the hard northern earth, beneath layers of snow and frozen soil, lay the Vikings' quiet answer to winter's hunger. The pit. Not a grand hall, nor a forge of iron, but a simple hollow in the ground, lined with straw, bark, or reeds where roots and hope lay sleeping. This was the secret that turned lean harvests into life, when the sun abandoned the north for half the year. The pit was a lesson passed down in whispers, how to hide food, from frost, rot, animals, and sometimes from neighbours, driven desperate by hunger's claw. Each pit was dug when the last golden leaves fell from the birch trees. Families chose well-drained ground, usually on the lee side of a hill where winds dumped protective drifts of snow. Too shallow, and frost would find the roots. Too deep, and meltwater would creep in to spoil them with damp. Experience and generations of buried mistakes taught them the perfect depth, often the height of a man's chest. Into these cold hollows they lowered baskets of turnips, skir-white roots, and sometimes even apples or wild onions, gathered before the final hard frost. Each layer was blanketed with dry straw or bracken fern, acting as a barrier against ice and the slow creep of decay. To seal the pit was its own ritual. Turf was replaced carefully, like a patch sewn back into the skin of the earth. Some families laid boards or bark sheets over the top to divert meltwater when spring teased warmth too early. Around the edges, stones were stacked to keep out foxes, rats, or wolves that might smell life where the land offered only death. A well-tended pit could hold enough roots to feed a family until the sun rose high again. Weeks, sometimes months of survival hidden under silent snow. But the pit alone was only half the secret. It demanded vigilance. Too warm, and the roots would sprout or rot. Too cold, and frost would turn them to mush. A trusted elder, often a mother or grandmother, would check the pits during midwinter thaws, scooping away ice, laying down fresh straw, resealing the earth like a careful midwife tending a sleeping child. When the dark nights stretched long, and the wind screamed like a witch across the frozen fields, the pit lay undisturbed beneath its blanket of soil. Inside the longhouse, Astrid might send Leif or his brother out with a basket, lantern in hand, to fetch what they needed to dig, gloved hands cold and raw, for the roots that would become tonight's thin stew or tomorrow's humble broth. The children learned early that this hidden store was not to be squandered. A single wasted turnip could mean hunger when the rivers were still frozen, when no fishing line could touch water, when game was too lean to hunt. Each root brought up from the pit was counted like coin, a treasure measured not in silver but in days of life. The pit was an ancient technology, yet ingenious in its simplicity. Without iron hinges or oak doors, it outperformed any wooden cellar for families too poor or too isolated to build one. In coastal settlements, where damp sea winds threatened every storehouse, the pit was more reliable than any shed. And so, in every corner of the Viking world, from rocky Norwegian farms to windswept Danish isles, the pit lay hidden under snow. It was the hearth's silent ally, the shield against the endless night, a reminder that sometimes survival demanded not the bold strike of an axe, but the quiet patience to bury hope deep in the ground, where frost could not find it. Dig into the frozen ground beneath a Viking pit, and you would find not just roots, but the memory of 1,000 winters survived by plants that most of the modern world has long forgotten. These were not soft garden vegetables bred for delicate flavours or perfect shapes. These were rough-hewn gifts from a stubborn land, hardy, frost-resistant, and so rugged they could outlast the gnawing cold when even meat could not. Foremost among them was the nape, the ancient ancestor of the turnip. To the Viking farmer, nape was more than food, it was insurance. Its pale bulbous roots thrived in thin soils where wheat failed and barley stunted. They could be left in the ground well into winter or lifted late and buried in pits lined with straw. Bitter when raw, they turned soft and sweet when boiled with salted fish or scraps of smoked pork. A single nape could stretch a thin broth into a meal for an entire household. Beside the nape lay angelica, tall and wild, its stems fragrant with a scent that seemed part celery, part musk. Astrid, tending her pits, prized angelica not just as food but as medicine. Rich in vitamin C, it held scurvy at bay when the sea lay locked beneath ice and no fresh fruit could be found. Chewed raw, brewed as a tonic, or candied with rare stores of honey, it was as vital as any weapon hung above the longhouse door. There was skirwhite, two spignal, or bald money, as some called it in later ages. A root like a leaner parsnip, its taste sharp and warming in winter stews. Its roots hid under rocky slopes where other crops failed, defying frost and poor soil alike. Where the nape fed the belly, skirwhite calmed the gut and kept cold fevers at bay. Fat hen chenopodium, a weed to modern farmers, but a blessing to Viking ones. Its seeds, small as dust, could be dried and ground into flour to thicken winter porridge. Its leaves, foraged in the hunger weeks when pits ran low, brought iron and green back to the hearth's table before spring thawed the fields. Along the storm-battered coasts, families gathered sea kale. They trudged down to salt-sprayed dunes and rocky inlets to cut its thick stalks and fleshy leaves, then dried or pickled them against lean months. In the pit, wrapped in brine or packed in wet sand, sea kale waited to share its salt-bright flavour when no garden dared grow. Each root and leaf had a story not just of survival, but of a people who knew how to read the land's hidden gifts. These vegetables were not chance finds. They were the products of patient knowledge, passed down the line from mother to daughter, father to son. They were sown in soil, churned by stones, and ploughed by rough hands, harvested with prayers that the frost would wait. When modern tongues speak of Viking strength, they rarely mention these forgotten vegetables. They praise the axe, the longship, the iron helm, yet it was the nape, the Angelica root, the humble fat hen that made the warrior's strong arm possible when snow turned the world silent and the hunt came back empty. In the darkness of the pit, these plants were more than food. They were time made edible, months hidden from wolves, starvation, and the cold bite of famine. Every root was a bargain struck with the land. Keep this safe, and I will see spring again. Astrid knew this bargain well. As she pushed aside the straw to lift out the last nape in February's cruel wind, she touched more than a root. She touched the promise that her family's line would not break under the weight of another winter. In the harsh north, where stone walls could not soften winter's bite and timber doors did little to hold back the snow's creeping fingers, the earth itself became the Vikings' quietest ally, an ancient, living pantry buried beneath frost and drifting snow. Across the scattered farmsteads that dotted Norway's coastal fjords, Sweden's forested valleys, and Denmark's low, wet fields, families learned to carve cold out of the ground. They turned shallow cellars into deep pantries and simple storage pits into primitive refrigerators that outmatched any wooden shed exposed to wind and rain. Some of these pantries were humble, a single pit dug behind the longhouse, lined with straw and thatch. Others were more cunning, dug into hillsides, hidden from animals and prying neighbours, shaped to hold not just roots, but barrels of salted herring, dried fish wrapped in cloth, and kegs of precious ale brewed when barley was plentiful. Where the land allowed, families dug turf-roofed outbuildings, partial cellars, half buried beneath mounds of earth, their low doors banked with snow to keep the cold in and vermin out. Inside, shelves of rough-hewn planks bore baskets of roots, ceramic jars of pickled cabbage, clay pots of sour milk turned to skyr, and butter wrapped in cloth. Here, beneath frost and darkness, food slept as soundly as the villagers around the hearth. In settlements along the coast, the underground pantry took on a unique form. Fish caught in summer's bounty herring, cod, and haddock were split and laid across racks to dry in the salt wind, then packed into barrels that disappeared into the cold earth once the skies turned grey. A well-packed fish barrel, salted tight and sealed with waxed cloth, could feed a family for weeks when the sea itself froze at the edges. Inside the longhouse, the pantry's bounty was rationed with discipline known only to those who have faced real hunger. Astrid, old and half-bent, moved between the hearth and the cellar door like a priestess guarding a shrine. The cellar's wooden hatch opened only at her word, a handful of turnips today, a wedge of smoked fish tomorrow, the last head of pickled cabbage, saved for a festival meal when daylight began its slow return. This hidden store was more than practical. It shaped how Vikings lived in winter's deep silence. With so much food buried below, journeys outdoors became measured risks. A boy, sent to fetch a basket of roots, learned to read the snow for the tracks of wolves or foxes drawn by the scent. The cellar was not only storage, but shelter and insurance policy that bought time when storms sealed doors shut for days or weeks. In a world without clocks, the underground pantry marked the passage of time. Every barrel emptied, every pit grown shallower, was a quiet promise that winter's end drew nearer. When the pits lay bare, and only the last fish bones lingered in salted barrels, the rivers would soon crack their ice, and green shoots would pierce the thawing ground. And yet, even in the leanest years, it was this simple underground wonder, neither glamorous nor sung about in skaldic verse, that made the Viking age possible. Without the pit, the cellar, the dark cold hollows beneath turf and stone, no axe-wielding warrior would have had the strength to stand on a foreign shore and roar Odin's name to the wind. It was here, beneath frost and earth, that the real battles against winter, were fought and won, one root, one salted fish, one carefully buried promise at a time. In the deep dark heart of winter, when the longhouse creaked under snow and the hearth's glow fought the endless cold, the Norse turned to a quiet magic that modern tongues barely remember, the slow alchemy of fermentation. Long before words like probiotic or gut health crossed a scholar's lips, Viking households understood that the difference between life and slow starvation lay not only in storing food, but in transforming it. Fermentation was their hidden craft, a way to stretch the harvest across months when the world beyond the walls was locked in ice. When autumn's final harvest came in, women and elders worked beside the hearth to shred cabbage and wild greens into long, pale ribbons. These were packed into heavy barrels or clay pots with handfuls of salt and pressed down with stones or carved wooden weights. In the warmth of the hearth corner, the brine began its quiet work, drawing out water, feeding unseen colonies of wild bacteria that turned crisp leaves into tangy, life-saving sour stores. This primitive sauerkraut, a word they did not know, but a practice they mastered, was no luxury. By midwinter, when fresh greens were a memory and the threat of scurvy crept into aching bones, a scoop of sour cabbage was medicine as much as food. It woke tired bellies, filled stews with a sharp bite, and replaced what long voyages and long dark days stole from the blood. Roots, too, found their place in this secret craft. Turnips and skirwhite were sometimes sliced and brined, their firm flesh softened into pickles that stayed edible deep into the frost months. Small onions, or wild garlic, gathered when the ground first thawed, were packed into earthen jars with salt, vinegar, or whey drained from soured milk, transforming sharp bulbs into pungent bursts of flavour for bland winter stews. Even seeds found new life. Fat hens' tiny seeds, swept up from fields and edges of barley plots, were sometimes mixed with ground grain and left to sour near the hearth's heat. The result? A kind of primitive sourdough, heavy but filling, its tang reminding a household that even bread could rise when the world lay cold and still. Beyond the barrels and jars, the air itself carried this knowledge. The tang of fermenting cabbage mingled with the smoke of drying fish, the sharp smell of ale casks bubbling with yeasts that danced unseen in the longhouse rafters. These were scents of survival, a hidden chorus of life that hummed beneath the surface of stone and frost. Astrid, keeper of her family's secrets, understood this magic well. By firelight, she taught her grandsons to watch the brine for bubbles, to taste the cabbage when the nights grew long, to trust their senses more than any rune or charm. When it bites the tongue but warms the belly, she would say, tapping the clay jar's rim, then the gods are pleased, and so is your mother's ghost. Fermentation was more than practicality, it was a promise that the living could outwit the dead season, that rot could be tamed, turned to preservation instead of loss. In the deepest cold, the sour tang in a wooden bowl spoke of warmth to come, of rivers that would crack their icy chains, of fields that would bloom green again. It was simple knowledge, a barrel packed with salted cabbage, a clay pot brimming with brine. Yet this humble craft meant the difference between a warrior with strength in his limbs and one who fell weak beside a frozen fjord. So, when the skalds sang of axes and shields, of dragon ships cleaving the grey sea, they left out the sour bite of brine that made it possible. In truth, each barrel of fermented cabbage, each clay pot of pickled greens, was a quiet hero of the Norse world, a secret weapon that fought frost, famine, and time itself. When the last boat was hauled ashore and the first frost rimmed the fjord, different kind of work began in the Viking world. the quiet labour of turning fresh bounty into something that could defy rot and winter's long silence. In every farmstead, smoke rose not just from the hearth, but from the lofts and sheds, where fish and meat met the oldest preservative of all, air and fire. Smokehouses dotted the Norse landscape like hidden shrines. Some were little more than timber sheds, half buried for warmth, their roofs vented by holes that spilled pale threads of smoke into the cold sky. Others were the rafters of the longhouse itself, where thin curls of fragrant haze drifted just below the turf roof, soaking fish, flesh, and strips of meat in a ghostly embrace that drove off insects and the slow creep of decay. Salt was precious traded for silver, or won in raids, but smoke was free for any who had wood and patience. In coastal villages, whole families worked for days splitting cod and herring, gutting them clean, then stringing them by the tail in long rows above a slow-burning fire. The smoke drifted upward, warm but never hot enough to cook. Instead, it whispered through the flesh, binding moisture, hardening the surface into a leathery shield against mold. The result was stockfish, an unassuming name for a Viking staple that powered sailors and farmers alike through months when the sea lay locked in ice. Light enough to carry on voyages, tough enough to last until the rivers cracked in spring, stockfish could be chewed as it was, soaked into stews, or beaten with a hammer to soften before boiling. A single fish, dried stiff as driftwood, could feed a man for days when all else failed. It was not just fish that met the smoke. Inland farmsteads dried slabs of mutton and pork, strung them from the beams of the longhouse where the hearth's warmth kept the air just damp enough to cure. Hunters brought home wild game deer, elk, even the occasional bear, and cut the meat into strips, salted if the clan could spare it, then hung it over smoky fires until it shriveled dark and firm. This quiet labour filled the dark hours before winter closed its jaws. Children learned to check the fires, to brush away creeping mould, to wrap dried cuts in cloth and hide them in pits alongside roots and barrels of pickled greens. A mistake smoked too thin, heat too high, meant precious stores could spoil overnight, turning winter from a test to a grave sentence. Astrid's hands, knotted with age, knew this work better than any blade. She could pinch a strip of drying fish and know if the smoke had taken hold. She could tell when the hearth fire must be banked lower, when the drafts needed closing to keep the air heavy and rich with the scent that would carry her family through lean moons. The smoke did more than preserve it flavoured. Even in the depth of January, when the wind howled and the pit offered up nothing but the last wilted roots, a handful of dried fish, simmered with turnip or cabbage, brought warmth and salt to tired mouths. The flavour was sharp and sometimes bitter, but it filled the belly and warded off the ache that hunger left behind the ribs. And so, above every Norse hearth, in the black rafters heavy with smoke and secrets, hung the lifeline of a people who refused to yield to the frost. While warriors sharpened axes and dreamed of far coasts, while skalds wove sagas of raids and glory, the true power to outlast the endless dark drifted up in thin blue curls, turning fresh flesh to stone, and time to an ally instead of an enemy. This was the final promise of the smokehouse. When the fields lay silent, when the boats lay locked in ice, when the world turned white and the wolves crept close, the taste of summer and the sea still lingered in strips of dried fish hanging in the dark. In the Viking world, the hearth was more than fire and flame, it was the living heart of the longhouse. The warm core that tethered every breath of life to survival, when the world beyond the timber walls turned white and merciless. Picture Astrid's longhouse once more. Snow heaps against the walls outside, drifting halfway up the turf roof. The wind howls across the fjord, rattling shutters and whispering beneath door frames that never quite shut out the cold. But inside, around the low central hearth, life endures. The hearth's coals burn low but steady, fed by carefully hoarded birch and spruce. Flames flicker against timber beams stained black by decades of smoke. Over the fire hangs a pot of broth, thin yet rich, with the ghost of summer's herbs, dried fish, and strips of salt pork taken from the smokehouse rafters. In winter, the hearth did more than cook food. Its warmth kept frost from creeping too deep into the pit cellars dug at the edge of the longhouse floor. It dried boots caked with ice, thawed hands cracked raw from hauling snow, or splitting firewood in winds that could freeze the skin in minutes. Families gathered here when the sun vanished for days. The children curled closest to the flames, wrapped in woolen cloaks and wolf pelts. The elders sat just beyond the heat's edge, guarding the balance between warmth and the risk of burning through precious fuel too fast. By firelight, hands stayed busy. Women spun wool into thread or mended fishing nets. Men carved handles for tools or smoothed spear shafts for hunts that would not come until the rivers thawed. Sometimes Astrid's sons returned from voyages with foreign luxuries, silver beads, an iron kettle from a Frankish market, but nothing so precious as the hearth's steady glow. Here, around the fire, knowledge passed from tongue to tongue. Which roots must be lifted from the pit first, which barrels of pickled cabbage would spoil if left unopened too long. A pot of fermented broth might bubble at the edge of the coals, sending up a sharp tang that mingled with the heavy smell of drying fish above. In the hush between chores, tales rose with the sparks of Odin and the ravens, of warriors who sailed west and never came back, of summers so green the fields seemed endless, and winters so cruel that only the hearth's glow stood between kin and the endless dark. The hearth was protection too. A single flame, kept alive through the long night, meant life in a land that could claim the careless in a breath. Each evening, the coals were banked with ash to smother flame, but keep a living ember. In the deep blue before dawn, Astrid would wake, push aside her sleeping furs, and stir that ember back to life, breathing warmth back into the timbered womb where her family slept. If the fire died, so did the family's hope. Without it, the pits would freeze too deep. The barrels would stiffen with frost, splitting wood and spoiling precious pickled stores. Fingers would fail at the tasks that filled the empty hours, and the wolves outside would seem closer, bolder, more than beasts, but hungry ghosts pressing at the door. In this way, the hearth bound every other secret together: the pit, the cellar, the smokehouse rafters. All drew their power from the same source: warmth against winter, flame against frost. In that flickering glow, the Viking Age's true miracle unfolded. Not only that they could take ships across storm-lashed seas, but that they could keep hope alive when the world turned cold enough to crack bone. So Astrid stirs her pot, hums an old song older than the sagas. Her grandsons sleep at her feet, faces warmed by the glow that guards them from the night. Above, strips of smoked fish sway gently in the draught. Beneath, roots lie hidden in their straw-lined pits. And in the hush between the wind's howl and the hearth's crackle, the quiet promise holds: they will see spring again. There comes a moment every autumn when the wind shifts, a cold breath from the north that rustles the last yellow birch leaves and whispers of the hunger to come. The Vikings knew this sign well. It marked the beginning of their final ritual before the land turned to iron and the sun slipped low for months on end, the night harvest. In the hush between sunset and frost's creeping touch, families rose before dawn, or lingered in the dusk to pull the last stubborn roots from the fields. By torchlight and hearth glow, carried on rough wooden lanterns, they bent their backs to the cold ground, feeling for the heft of nape buried deep in stony soil. Leif, Astrid's grandson, worked these nights beside his father and older brothers. Bare hands plunged into icy dirt, numbed and scraped raw as they tugged each turnip free and passed it down the line. Behind them, Astrid waited at the edge of the pit, straw and bracken ready to cradle the harvest before frost could claim it. Not all roots were lifted at once. The clever farmer knew which plots to strip clean and which to leave buried beneath a thick quilt of straw, and brush a gamble that in mild winters could keep fresh roots crisp longer than any pit, though too much trust in the weather could end in rot. Along the forest's edge, women gathered the last wild greens, late shoots of angelica, stray nettles, toughened by cold, but still worth their weight in broth. In coastal settlements, entire families trudged down to stormy beaches, scraping sea kale from rocky inlets, packing it into barrels brined for the long sleep ahead. Sometimes these final gathers stretched into the night because daylight fled too fast. Bundles of rush torches flickered in the mist, half shielded from the wind by cupped hands. Children ran ahead with baskets, small shadows darting through the stubbled fields, their laughter, muffled by breath, turned white in the chill. Every gleaning had its ritual. The strongest roots laid at the bottom of the pit, the bruised or blemished ones used first, lest rot spread ruin through the buried hoard. Sea kale packed tight against salt barrels to seal out moisture. Cabbage leaves wrapped in coarse cloth, tucked close together so the outermost spoiled first, sparing the heart. In these final frantic days, the line between enough and not enough could be as thin as a single lost basket. A fox sniffing at an uncovered pit could ruin weeks of careful labour. A sudden frost too early could lock the ground before the last harvest came free. The old ones knew this and watched the sky for omens, the wind for warning. These night harvests were not a festival but a quiet reckoning. No songs of mead horns and battle glories rose over these fields, only the rustle of straw, the scrape of iron spades in stone-riddled soil, the hush of boots on frost-hardened paths as baskets moved from earth to pit, from pit to cellar, from cellar to hearth. When it was done, when the last root found its place beneath straw and turf, when the pits were sealed with boards and earth, when the barrels were sunk into cold ground and the sea kale lay brined in salt, only then did Astrid's people breathe easier. For better or worse, they had played their hand against winter. The rest was patience and prayer. That night, when the wind keened like wolves across the fjord, Leif and his brother lay near the hearth. They smelled smoke and stew, the warmth of salted fish turning soft in the pot. Beneath them, deep under frozen ground, the night harvest waited silent roots dreaming in the cold, the last fragile promise that the north could be tamed by human hands if only for another season. By the time the snows lay heavy across the fjord and the winds turned the nights into iron chains, the pit and cellar were no longer just storage, they were treasure vaults, and every Norse household knew they needed guarding. The sagas rarely speak of this quiet defence. They tell of shield walls and raids, of fortresses and sea battles, but the truest siege of Viking life happened not on distant shores, but beneath the floorboards of the homestead, where the family's hidden wealth. Buried roots and barrels, tempted enemies, smaller and closer than any Saxon blade. Astrid knew this war well. As matron of the house, she was keeper of the pit, high priestess of the cellar's secrets. Her grandsons, Leif and Bjorn, learned early that the real battle each winter was not just the wolves that circled at the forest's edge, but the tiny teeth and claws that sought their way beneath the turf. Rats and mice cunning, tireless waited for the warmth of the hearth and the scent of stored barley, dried fish, and cabbage brine. Each evening, before the family settled by the hearth's glow, Leif crept through the cold hallway to the cellar door, lantern trembling in his mittened hand. He checked the stones stacked at the pit's mouth, tapped the boards for signs of gnawing, scattered ash to trace the faint footprints of any intruder bold enough to slip through the cracks. If he found signs droppings, a telltale hole burrowed at the corner where the turf wall met the frozen ground, Astrid set the traps. Not with iron, which was too precious, but with simple cunning. Pits lined with slick bark, baited with scraps of dried fish that no wolf would dare steal, but which rats found irresistible. She taught the boys to listen for the scratching in the night, to hush their breath so the smallest sound beneath the floor did not pass unnoticed. And it was not only beasts that threatened the horde. Sometimes, when winters grew cruel and a neighbour's cellar failed damp ruin, an early mould, a barrel, spoiled by careless brining desperation, could make men worse than rats. A missing cabbage head here, a barrel's lid pried loose there. No warrior's pride could fill an empty belly when snow sealed every door. So Eric, the father, kept a spear by the door even when the axe lay on its rack above the hearth. He rose before dawn to pace the perimeter of the homestead, lantern swinging as he peered into drifts for bootprints that did not belong to family or kin. He trusted neighbours as brothers in summer, but watched them like strangers come deep February. The cellar door itself bore a charm, a circle of simple runes, carved by Astrid's own father when she was a girl. Not magic enough to stop a hungry man or cunning rat, but a reminder that what lay beneath the earth was sacred, the difference between life and death, kin and empty grave. When Leif or Bjorn fetched roots from the pit, Astrid made them recite a rhyme, half blessing, half warning. What we take, we guard. What we guard, we keep. What we keep, we live. A child's words, but weighty as any iron lock in a world where locks were rare and trust was thin as winter's sunlight. It was an endless, tireless watch. A careless boy, too quick with a pit lid left ajar, could cost the family weeks of food in a single night's visit by vermin. A hungry neighbour, desperate and shamed, might snatch a barrel in the dark and vanish across the snow. Yet in this small hidden war, Astrid's people showed the same fierce discipline they brought to ship and shield. For in the Norse mind, a well-guarded cellar was a fortress, and each rat trapped, each root checked for rot, each quiet footstep across snow-packed fields was an act of defiance, proof that they would not yield to the cold, the dark, or the silent hunger that prowled at every door. In a land where the sun slipped away for weeks at a time, sleep was not a simple escape, but another tool in the Vikings' arsenal against the long, devouring cold. And, like the pit, the cellar, and the smokehouse rafters, it too was guarded, shaped by rhythms, older than any saga and wiser than any blade. Unlike modern folk, who chase an unbroken 8 hours behind shuttered windows and the hum of false light, the Norse lived by the breathing dark. The longhouse bent itself to the sun's retreat, its timber bones creaking as the hours of daylight shrank to a fleeting grey. Yet inside, the hearth's glow stretched the night into 2 parts. Not one block of slumber, but a cycle broken like the frozen river that split, then healed again come spring. The old ones called it Førstasveffen, the first sleep, and Anathsveffen, the second sleep. After the final chores were done, the last roots checked, the cellar sealed against the wolves and the rats, families lay down on raised sleeping benches, that lined the longhouse walls. Furs were pulled tight, the hearth banked low to a red hush. For 4 or 5 hours, sleep came deep and unbroken. But then, as surely as frost found the doorframe, a stirring woke them. The fire needed tending, the beasts in their byres checked for warmth. Someone rose to add fresh wood, to stir the coals into flame. Mothers might stir porridge for the next day, or sew by the faint glow of oil lamps. Men mended nets, sharpened small blades, whispered stories that felt too fragile for daylight's weight. This waking was no burden. It was woven into the rhythm of survival, a space between sleeps when the cellar could be checked for signs of trouble, when traps for mice were inspected before dawn's hush. Astrid, half blind with age, would wake just enough to send Leif to the pit door, lantern in hand, to be sure no drift had cracked the seal, no fox's paw had clawed at the straw. And then, when the fire was fed, the watch made, and the hush satisfied, they would slip back into the second sleep, the deeper rest before dawn. The hearth's new warmth spread into every timber. The wind battered the roof, but inside all was heavy with breath and dreams. Modern eyes might see this fractured slumber as primitive, but in truth it matched the winter's cruel demand. A single long sleep would have left the fire to die, the cellar unwatched, the hoarded food, an easy feast for vermin or hungry shadows in the night. This natural rhythm made each waking a quiet watchman's shift, a moment to guard the precious roots sleeping beneath the frozen earth, the barrels of pickled greens, the smoked fish hanging in the rafters. Even dreams bent to this need. In the sagas, warriors dreamed of Valhalla and its endless feasts, but in these hours between sleeps, Astrid dreamed, instead of green shoots piercing thawed ground, of barrels still half full when the ice finally cracked. So they rested not just in darkness but in vigilance, the small stirring before dawn, the slow feeding of the coals, the soft scrape of boots over rush-strewn floors. The hush was alive with purpose. The pit, the cellar, the hearth, the humans bound to them, all beat in the same pulse. When dawn came, pale and grudging, Astrid's family rose not from one long sleep, but from a double vigil, half rest, half watch. In this simple dance with darkness, they held back the wolves for one more day, one more night, until the river would run free again, and the hidden roots beneath the snow would yield to green fields once more. For all their iron swords and dragon-headed ships, the Norse were not conquerors alone. They were traders, cunning as foxes, carrying the secrets of their hidden pits and smoky lofts into a world that hungered for what the North alone could give. When the rivers thawed and the long nights cracked into pale dawns, the same salted fish that hung in Astrid's rafters found their way onto distant tables. Stockfish cod dried stiff as driftwood in the cold north wind was worth its weight in silver among the Saxons and the Franks, who had little fish of their own in the inland forests and rivers choked by warmer airs. The pit's quiet hoard nape, angelica, wild onions rarely travelled far on its own, but the power of these hidden stores lay in what they freed the Vikings to do, to leave home, to push out into distant seas while others clung close to hearth and field. The pits and cellars meant families could spare men for voyages. They made raiders bold, knowing their kin would eat through storms and delays. Salt was dear in the north, worth the steel to forge blades, or the amber carried back from Baltic shores. To keep their fish, their pork, their game fresh against rot's ruin, the Norse traded far and wide. Slabs of stockfish for the white salt of the west coasts, barrels of pickled herring for fine cloth from the Frankish kingdoms. Amber, furs, iron tools, all changed hands because the hidden bounty of pits and cellars bought them time. Picture Eric's sons, Leif's older brothers, braced against salt wind on the open sea, sails fat with spring gales, barrels of dried fish and smoked lamb stowed under deck planks. Each barrel was more than food, it was currency. In the markets of Hedeby, in the courts of Dublin or York, traders haggled hard over these plain wares. One barrel of dried herring might return home as salt enough for a season's preservation. Another might buy precious iron rivets for the next ship, or foreign spices to steep new flavour into an old pot. The hidden cellar bound them to distant lands. When they traded fish, they traded the patience of the woman who smoked it, the boy who watched the fire at dusk, the father who salted each cut tight to the bone. When they offered barrels of pickled cabbage, they offered the cold sweat of autumn harvests and the restless nights spent guarding pits from rats and ruin. No Viking warlord stood mighty on stolen gold alone. His sails rose because smoked fish lined the ship's hull, keeping hunger's edge from fraying the sharpness of men. His sword hand was strong because his farmstead was fed by roots that waited patient beneath packed earth, guarded through snows and storms by wives, mothers, and children who knew the price of wasting even a single nape. So when traders from the south sniffed at the simple wares of the north, the rough barrels and leathery fish, the root bundles hidden in baskets lined with straw, they forgot what these humble things could buy. Time to sail, freedom to raid, the strength to stand against kings whose silver ran deep, but whose winter trick was shallow indeed. In this quiet exchange of salt and root, smoke and silver, the Norse carved a world-spanning web of barter that stretched from the whale coasts of Greenland to the rivers of Kiev, the wine halls of Francia to the stone ports of Byzantium. And in the dark heart of that web lay Astrid's pit, sealed tight beneath snow. Each humble barrel, each salted fish, each pale root made the Viking age possible, not just swords and sails, but the old quiet magic of survival turned outward into the world. Beneath the snow and earth, among straw and buried roots, the Norse tucked more than food into their pits and cellars, they buried faith. In a world where winter was a living enemy, no harvest was truly safe without whispers to ward off what the knife could not see. Astrid knew this well. Long before her hair turned silver, she learned from her mother the runes that guarded the pit. Simple shapes carved into a plank laid across the cellar mouth. Algis for protection. Gera for good harvest. A fragment of iron buried beside the first layer of roots. Not a blade iron was too precious for wasting, but an old nail, bent and black with years. Iron to bind the soil against mischief. For in the Norse mind, the threats to their hidden bounty were not only rats and frost. Spirits lingered at the edge of the hearth's glow. The Vetter landwights watched from field and forest. Please them, and they might guide the snow's chill away from the pit. Offend them, and the roots might turn soft, the barrels swell and burst with mould. So Astrid placed small offerings at the pit's edge, before the final lid of turf sealed it shut for winter's rain. A twist of dried herbs, a drop of ale spilled into the frozen soil, a whispered word of thanks to the unseen keepers of the land. Inside the longhouse, above the cellar hatch, charms dangled on leather cords, carved bits of bone, a raven feather caught and tied with red wool, a circle of runes etched into driftwood from the fjord's edge. These were not church blessings the White Christ's priests had yet to tame the far valleys where Astrid's kin kept the old ways alive by hearth-fire hush. These were older prayers, spoken in the tongue of soil and smoke. Sometimes, when food was plentiful, a family might bury the bones of last year's feast beneath the fresh pit. Lamb shoulder, fish spine, small tokens to tell the earth, what you gave, we return. Give again. It was barter, like all Viking life, a trade struck with land and spirits alike. Children like Leif learned early not to mock these customs. They saw how even a father like Eric, a man who had crossed the sea to raid foreign churches, lowered his voice when Astrid sprinkled salt around the cellar door. How he muttered a half prayer to the ancestors when the first barrel was sealed with waxed cloth. Sometimes fear bred new rites. A sudden thaw that ruined pickled greens might be blamed on a spiteful spirit. Then the family might burn sweet herbs at the hearth, send the youngest to bury ash at the pit's edge, or carve fresh runes into cellar beams. Whether these acts changed the ice and mould mattered less than the hush they gave to worry, a sense that the unseen might be placated, the secret trick kept alive another season. And so, hidden beneath the weight of practical work, the digging, the layering of straw, the smoke that hardened fish flesh, lay a second shield, belief. A shield wrought not of oak or iron, but of runes, whispered words, small charms, half forgotten by the time spring thawed the last drifts. When Astrid lay in her sleeping furs at night, the snow pressing like a ghost against the timber walls, she did not fear the wolves alone. She feared the rot that crept silent, and the spirits that might slip through a careless crack in the pit's seal. So she pressed her palm to the rune plank at the cellar mouth, murmured her mother's old promise. What sleeps below, sleep well. What waits above, guard it true. In this simple, secret faith, the Norse bound frost and hunger with more than pits and barrels. They bound them with hope that even the coldest dark might respect the quiet magic of human hands, words, and the earth itself. Outside the longhouse, winter's true teeth waited in the snowdrifts and black tree lines. Wolves, gaunt and patient, the shadowed rivals to Astrid's hidden pit. In the Norse world, the wolf was more than an animal. It was hunger-made flesh, a reminder that in the harsh north, nothing stayed buried for long if claws and fangs found a scent. Stories told of Fenrir, the giant wolf fated to swallow the sun at Ragnarok. But the wolves that haunted the edge of Eric's farmstead needed no prophecy to drive them, only the promise of warm flesh and the scent of salted meat bleeding through a loose cellar lid. In the deep night, when snow covered every trail and the hearth's glow was the only warmth for miles, the wolves crept near. Leif heard them sometimes as he lay on the sleeping bench, the steady breath of his brother beside him. A low growl carried on the wind, the soft crackle of paws crossing the frozen yard. Once, Astrid caught sight of a pale shape slipping behind the stacked firewood, eyes glinting like coals before it vanished into the drifting dark. For these wolves, a pit of buried roots meant nothing but a careless door left unlatched. A barrel rolled too close to the walls could draw them in. A wolf pack, desperate enough, would scratch through turf and frozen soil if hunger pressed its ribs close to bone. And when the wolves came, they did not come alone. Their presence pulled other scavengers in their wake, foxes, crows, even neighbours' hungry dogs turned half wild when food ran low. In the harshest years, a wolf at the door meant the pit's secret might be devoured in a single night, leaving nothing but scattered bones and footprints trailing off into the pine woods. So the pit was sealed with more than turf and straw. Spears were propped by the door. Sled tracks were brushed away to hide the path to the hidden store. Boys like Leif took turns on watch in the cold hush before dawn, eyes squinting at shadows moving beyond the fences. Sometimes, when the snow grew so deep that even wolves struggled to move, they would circle the farmstead for days, haunting the dreams of those inside. The people said they could hear them breathing at the walls, an exhale of frost, a rasp of claws at frozen timber. Mothers whispered to children that Odin's wolves, Jerry and Freki, came to test the worthy, to remind them that what lay buried must be protected by courage, not by luck alone. Yet the wolves did more than steal food. They made the pit more precious with every howl. Their hunger hardened the farmer's resolve. Each time Astrid sent Leif out to brush snow back over the cellar's hidden door, she reminded him what the family's survival meant. That the difference between a warrior's strong arm in spring and a corpse under the snow was measured not in silver or swords, but in how well one guarded what slept beneath the frost. And so the wolves paced the edge of the fields, while fires flickered in the longhouse. They were the silent rivals of every root and barrel buried deep, the cold breath at the neck of every Norse homestead when the world turned white. When spring finally came, the snow rotted under the first warm rains, and the wolves slipped back into the forest's dark tangolina, fewer, their season of rule broken by the green spears of new shoots and the thawed strength of human hands. But until that thaw, the pit remained a secret fortress, a test of watchfulness and cunning forever hidden beneath the snow, safe only so long as the wolves outside were kept at bay by spear, song, and a steadfast hearth's glow. When the night sky cracked with the coldest stars, and the wind fell quiet in its longest breath, the Norse gathered around their hearths for a different kind of battle cry, not one of blade and shield, but of warmth and hidden abundance brought into the open for a single, defiant night, the midwinter feast. To outsiders, the feast might have looked humble, no golden goblets, no mountains of meat, as the Sköld's later tales would boast. But to Astrid's kin, each bowl ladled by the fire was proof that their secret winter trick had held fast against frost, vermin, and the hungry wolves that prowled the dark. By late January or early February, the worst lay behind them. The sun lingered a little longer each day, though it still hid its face behind low hills and skeletal trees. When that first promise of light came at dawn, that held a hush softer than the howling dark, Astrid's family gathered what they could spare from pit and cellar. A head of pickled cabbage, pungent but sweet with the bite of brine. Dried stockfish, hammered soft with mallets, soaked in warm broth until it flaked like fresh catch. A handful of nape roots, the strongest survivors of the pit, peeled and boiled to softness beside slivers of smoked pork, the last scraps from the loft's rafters. This was not feasting, as kings might know it, but it was triumph all the same. Each dish carried the scent of patience and hidden labour, the autumn's frantic harvest, the cold nights of guarding cellars, the whispered prayers to the landwights that the pits would hold their secrets safe. Neighbours, too, might gather at a single hearth, each family bringing what they could spare. A smoked trout from the fjord village, a small barrel of ale from last summer's barley. Children, half asleep, pressed close to their parents' sides, while elders told stories that crackled in the firelight tales of winters harsher than this one, of a year when the pits failed and famine's claws left new graves in the snow. But tonight there was no talk of loss. Tonight Astrid's grandsons chewed dried fish, softened in broth, and laughed at each other's grimaces when the sour cabbage bit their tongues. Tonight the pit's horde rose to the table like a secret army, defending them with each mouthful against the last grip of winter's claws. The hearth roared brighter than on any other night. Sparks rose to the rafters where the last of the smoked cuts still swung like silent trophies. Outside, the wolves watched from the edge of the dark woods, but their hunger meant nothing now inside the longhouse. Warmth and fullness closed every door against the shadows. In some homes, the midwinter feast bore older names, Chora Blot, a rite to honour Thor and the spirits of the land. In others, it was no formal offering, but a private sign that they had endured. Either way, the bones left from the meal were buried near the pit's edge the next day, a small gift to the earth that had sheltered them. "Take this," the burial whispered. "Do not forget us when we call on you again." By the hearth's red glow, Astrid watched her grandsons drift to sleep, full-bellied and safe. She knew that outside, snow still lay deep, that lean weeks could still come before the Thor's return. But for now, the pit had given its gift, life held back from the wolves, from frost, from the hush of an empty grave. This was the real feast the Norse carried forward, not silver or stolen gold, but the quiet victory of hidden roots, smoked fish, salted barrels. And as the skalds later sang of kings and heroes, the true songs were the whispers of cellars sealed tight beneath frozen earth, the laughter of children chewing dried fish by firelight when the storm's worst had passed. The crackling hearth, the pit hidden beneath snow, the careful layering of straw and frost, all these once ordinary acts slipped into shadows as the centuries rolled on. The quiet trick that carried the North through endless winters faded from memory, replaced by walls of brick and iron stoves that promised warmth at the turn of a dial. As kingdoms rose where clans once scraped fields from stone, new wealth arrived in the North. Traders brought glass windows to banish drafts, coal to heat stone houses, cheap salt in sacks instead of risky raids for distant shores. The hidden pit was abandoned first, its back-breaking digging traded for cellars, dug deeper, braced with stone and brick. Then came cellars replaced by pantries by shelves lined with tins and jars bought in markets, where salt fish and nape roots were traded for tea and sugar from far-off colonies. When the age of machines roared across Europe, electricity flickered into the darkest corners. Iceboxes lined urban homes. Root cellars shrank to damp corners beneath stairwells, half-forgotten storage for potatoes that no longer tasted of brine and survival, but of convenience. The war cry of the Norse turned into quiet street corners in Oslo and Bergen, Reykjavik and Copenhagen, warm houses where children no longer rose in the dark to brush fox tracks from a pit's edge. Wolves were banished to fairy tales. Hunger drifted from everyday fear to a ghost of stories whispered by grandmothers who remembered their own grandmothers, muttering runes over barrels sealed with wax. But the old knowledge did not vanish all at once. In scattered farmhouses, far from city lamps, some families clung to it stubborn as frost. An elderly farmer might still bury turnips beneath matted straw or brine cabbage in a barrel sunk into a hillside. A grandmother, like Astrid, might pass down a rhyme: "What we bury, we keep. What we keep, we live." Yet by the mid-20th century, even these voices faded beneath the hum of refrigerators and the glitter of supermarket aisles. Modern eyes, when they look back on the Vikings, see only iron and salt spray ships cutting grey seas, axes raised, monasteries sacked. Few imagine the quiet genius of a root pit sealed under snow, the simple engineering that outmatched kings' palaces when storms came. Today, shelves overflow with food flown in from every corner of the world. Fruit that never knew frost lies soft in baskets beside vegetables, bred for sweetness, not survival. Children fear wolves only on storybook pages, yet hunger, the oldest wolf of all, still waits at the edge when supply chains falter and storms close roads that never existed for Astrid's kin. Some see this and wonder if the old pit might teach us again. Across the north, new voices dig back into frozen earth root cellars, built beneath modern farmhouses. Barrels of sour cabbage packed in basements, lined with local stone. In backyards and homesteads, people turn again to the simple promise of a root buried deep and guarded well. A secret so old, it feels new once more. If Astrid could see them, these quiet gardeners, these winter watchers, she would know her secret never really died. It sleeps, as roots sleep beneath snow, waiting for the right hands to dig, to line the pit with straw, to whisper thanks to earth and frost alike. In this forgotten trick lies a truth more enduring than any raid or scold's boast, that the power to outlast the longest winter does not lie in swords or silver, but in the patience to bury hope deep, to guard it well, and to lift it up when hunger scratches at the door. Long after the last longship sank into fjord mist, after iron swords rusted to earth and scold songs faded beneath church bells and factory whistles, the simple secret of the pit slept on a lesson hidden beneath centuries of stone and snow. What remains today is more than an echo of root cellars and smoky rafters. It is a reminder that the fiercest warriors of the north were not only those who swung axes beneath raven banners, but those who bent their backs to cold soil, layered straw over nape, salted fish in barrels that could float down a river, or sleep beneath frost for months unspoiled. The legacy of the cellar is quiet resilience, the wisdom to gather while there is plenty, to guard while others feast without thought, to trust that patient labour and humble stores can outlast storms that even iron and silver cannot tame. In modern winters, bright with electric heat and stores that never close, the pit might seem a relic. Yet, when floods wash roads away, when storms fell power lines, when shelves stand empty under flickering lights, something ancient stirs in memory. We remember that survival was once not a matter of wealth, but of cunning, of watching the sky for omens, of burying roots deep enough to hide from frost, of tending a fire that never dies, so long as hands and eyes remain to guard it. Those who dig new cellars now, who pack straw around carrots and beets, who hang meat to smoke above coals, who pack jars of brine and salt into cool earth, do more than preserve food. They preserve a story older than kingdoms, a story of human hands shaping hunger into hope, cold into warmth, winter into a test endured and overcome. Astrid's grandsons would grow, as all children do. They would sail far, build houses of stone and timber, bury their own roots in other valleys. Yet each would carry the hush of the pit with them, the patient rhythm of lifting a turnip from straw, the soft chant of runes scratched on cellar doors, the weight of understanding that life, however fierce and ironclad, rests on what we bury wisely and guard well. And if today you stand above frozen earth shovel in hand, breath white in cold dusk, and you scrape away snow to open a hidden cellar door, know this: you are not alone. Astrid's line, and the line of 1,000 nameless keepers, stand behind you. They watch your careful hands, your quiet work, and nod in silent kinship. For the true Viking legacy is not only raiding distant shores or carving runestones that defy rain and wind. It is the small, stubborn act of survival, the belief that a root buried deep can feed a village, that a half-guarded well can hold back the longest night, that when wolves circle in darkness, a quiet secret beneath the snow is stronger than any sword. This is the secret winter trick that kept the Vikings alive for months, and perhaps one day it may yet save us again.